Wednesday night I realized I must deal with this theme. I'm beginning to go back over and review a series that we introduced here about a half a decade ago, nearly, based on our Wednesday night study. We'll be looking at two things today, two measures of information out of the Old Testament, and then we want to tie that in with New Testament teaching. Again, going back to the Wednesday night discussion, it was obvious the question of what happens to me after I die is the most gripping topic we could consider. Some have even said it is the most existential of all questions in the sense of personal, meaningful. And it must be, because every one of us realizes that soon we will leave this world. Sooner in the case of some, we know not when that time will be. Later for others, but at best, relatively speaking, it will be soon for all of us. So what happens when we die? What does the Bible teach on this most gripping of all subjects? I would hope that it is. Now, I know this about my fellow Americans. We've pretty much cast off restraints. There are no inhibitions, and we'll talk about anything, everything, to the extent of being very coarse, very crude. But there's one taboo subject still, they say. This is it. This is the taboo. Nice people don't talk about death. You can do so in a lighthearted way. You can make fun of the whole issue. But seriously, to speak of this can be offensive. Really? What could be more important than ask what happens to me when I pass from the scene? If anything, do I continue to live? If a man die, will he live again? This is the question of Job, a question that has been heard throughout the ages, that has been asked countless times. And I know we're asking it. We all do. We must. You can't be human and not face this situation. So I want to talk about this and introduce this particular point right now. Sadly, many who read their Bibles are of contrary opinions. There are some who allege that the Bible never clearly teaches the idea of life after death. At least not until you arrive to the New Testament era. And even then, it's ambiguous, they would allege. And much of what you hear and read from the New Testament, well, it comes from some ideas borrowed from religious neighbors of the Israelites. For example, during the captivity in Babylon. Well, that's an allegation that's made, and I want to lay to rest that allegation forever if we could just go back and see that the Scriptures do, in fact, teach that there will be life after death, and that in the earliest of books. Now, this is important also, a second point to keep in mind. God did not reveal everything about what will happen to me when I die right up front in the beginning of His Word. It was a matter of many generations of slowly but surely telling us through His prophets, prophetic men who were the authors of our Old Testament, what would take place. So God gradually has let us know more and more and would shed a little more light on the situation from time to time. This is what we know as progressive revelation. Progressive in the sense of God would add bit by bit to what He had previously said, so that at the end of the Bible, of course, at the close of the New Testament, we have the full picture. But we're starting now with the earliest stages and looking at the question of life after death in the Bible. And surprisingly, there is much actually there. We want to notice 6 basic questions, and this is sort of a review, but I think it will help us all face this most important of human concerns. Did the Old Testament teach human survival after death? And will it be me? Will it be me? Will I be the one to survive? Or will it be some other entity somehow related to me, but not myself? That's one theory. If the Bible, in fact, in the Old Testament, did teach the idea of life after death, what part of us will survive the grave? Will it be our body? Well, will it be the spirit, in the Hebrew known as ruach? Will it be the soul, in the Hebrew known as the nephesh? What part will survive? If the Old Testament teaches that there's some part of me that will survive, a part that's not physical, then how is the realm or sphere where it goes related to other teachings about heaven and hell, for example? Where does my non-material part go after I die? According to these early teachings, does the Old Testament endorse the idea of resurrection? I must stop now. I'll pause here for a moment to explain when this word is used, what it means and what it does not mean. When resurrection is used in the technical sense, it refers to this fact that the spirit has been disunited from the body. What makes us alive now, according to James chapter 2, verse 26, is the unity of spirit and body. The body without the spirit is dead. So when the spirit leaves the body, then the body ceases to be alive. Well, the concept of resurrection is that one day there will be a joining of the spirit and the body so that the body is reanimated. But more than that, and this is crucial, the body will also be changed. It will be transformed. As David was reading a moment ago, it will be a different body, but there will be continuity, yet difference. Continuity, yet a difference. It will be in a glorified state. That's what we mean by resurrection. So let me clarify that up front when we ask that question. Did the Old Testament hint at this idea, or is this borrowed simply from the Persians, as some Bible scholars today would allege? Is this just a new idea that sort of evolved during the intertestamental period, the times between the two testaments, the Old and the New Testament, basically a 400-year period of prophetic silence? Well, we'll find out from the Bible. And does it teach that all will survive? Does the Old Testament mention that, or just some, maybe the righteous only? And is there a concept of punishment after this life is over? Is this found in the earliest days? Well, let's start looking at several passages. We're not going to see them all, but just representative ones. We have what we call the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy, where God says, "It is I who put to death and give life." Now, the Jews looked at this passage and they thought that this does imply, it implies that God can give life even to dead people. So from verses like this, they were able to infer, and I believe correctly, that there is a hint at least of a hope of life after death. And this sort of reminds us of the description of the creation of man in the beginning anyway, where God breathed into that lifeless body the breath of life, and man became a living soul, a living being, or nephesh. We have also the Song of Hannah, 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 6, where it is said, "The Lord kills and makes alive. He brings down to Sheol and raises up." That's a concept we'll explore in a few moments from now. But God can make someone come to life. Later on, Jewish commentaries looked at this verse, and they said this does suggest that the spirit leaves the body at death and goes into a place known as Sheol, which in the Greek would be called, as we shall see, Hades. Sheol would be, of course, the Hebrew word. Hosea chapter 6 and verse 2. Now let me also say, we are at this point looking at a part of Bible history that comes before the time the Jews were sent off into exile, before Judah was taken into Babylonian captivity. Why does that matter for this subject? Again, it goes back to the allegation that some make that the Jews simply borrowed the idea of life after death from people in the exile, from their captors in Babylon, and from the Persians who later came and took over the Babylonian rule over the Jews there in that foreign country. Well, we will see that in fact these texts that are before the exile, that is pre-exilic, do teach life after death. And that is significant to know what the Bible actually has been saying all along. He will revive us after 2 days. He will raise us up on the third day that we may live before Him. Now, this does seem to suggest the idea of a resurrection, the possibility thereof. And this is probably a verse that Paul has in mind in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 4, when he talks about how that Christ was raised from the dead the third day according to the Scriptures. So it may have been messianic in intent. And again, the Jews thought that this referred, of course, to a resurrection of the dead at the end of the world. In Hosea chapter 13, verse 14, the question is asked, "Shall I ransom them from the power of Sheol? Shall I redeem them from death? O death, where are your plagues? O Sheol, where is your sting?" Compassion is hidden from my eyes, the English Standard Version. Now this shows that God, of course, has power over the grave. I think we would have all guessed that based on the fact He's the Creator and He made us to begin with. but it's clearly stated, and we know that he has power over death. Paul does allude to this text in 1 Corinthians 15, which is a key text when we arrive at the New Testament, where he says, "For this corruptible must put on incorruption, and this mortal must put on immortality. So when this corruptible shall have put on incorruption, and this mortal shall have put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass this saying that is written, Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory?" Who possibly has such a hope that he could chide death in that way? Who would be so bold as to mock and scoff at death, man's greatest enemy? Well, the Christian, the child of God, can do so, because this is actually a song of victory. In Job chapter 19, again, way back in the earliest part of the Bible, perhaps one of the earliest books ever written in our Hebrew Bible, chapter 19, 25 to 27, we have this strange statement, "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another. My heart faints within me." Well, right up front we need to know that scholars who have viewed this have said the Hebrew is notoriously difficult here. There has apparently been maybe some corruption and transmission, copying of the text over the centuries, and it's a little bit difficult to know what he's saying, and the words are hard to translate. But I think the English Standard has a very, very close rendition of what the Hebrew, for the most part, was intending to say. Job seems vaguely aware of the fact he will live after this life is over. That long ago, that hope is found elsewhere in the Bible. Psalm 73, verse 24, "With thy counsel thou wilt guide me, and afterward receive me to glory." Now, again, I am convinced these Psalms, many of them, are pre-exilic, and that this is one, and that here we have a clear statement that there will be a reward after this life is over. In Psalm 16 and verse 10, we have a very familiar statement. We see it a lot in the New Testament. "For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption." This is a psalm of David. Now, David is not really speaking of himself, because, as a matter of fact, his body did see corruption. It is now corrupted, and it is there in the Holy Land, in that tomb, the tomb of David, corrupted. So this could not refer to himself. And as we see in the New Testament, the apostles apply this to Jesus. That short period of time after he was crucified, while his body was in the tomb of Joseph, it was not there putrefying, it was not there decomposing. There just wasn't enough time. His soul, his spirit, was in a realm known as Hades, the Hadean realm, which specifically we could say the compartment thereof would be paradise, as Jesus himself says. So this psalm then in the New Testament is applied to this question, and it is evidence in favor of life after death, even in the Old Testament. Psalm 49:15, "But God will redeem my soul from the power of Sheol." Again, Sheol, the unseen world of the dead, the nether world, that hidden realm where we go, some portion of us, after we pass from this life. And some have said that these kinds of verses, because there are several like this in the Old Testament, could be called rescue texts. God will rescue the righteous from Sheol. And so they say this means that when you're on the verge of the brink of dying, just before you go into Sheol, some would allege, God will rescue you. He'll pull you away from the brink. That's possible. But it's not likely in the case of many of these verses where it seems that one is already in Sheol, and God can rescue one from Sheol who has already died, who has left this life. So I think that we can say these are also evidences in favor of life after death in the pre-exilic teachings of the Bible. Isaiah chapter 25 and verse 8, "He will swallow up death forever." Isn't that beautiful? "And the Lord will wipe away tears from all faces. And the reproach of his people he will take away from all the earth. For the Lord has spoken." The Lord has spoken. We're not just involved in some sort of arid study of the Old Testament, technical points. The Lord himself speaks to us in this passage that we have looked at and in all these verses. And what he says should be of great interest to every single one of us. If a man die, will he live again? Yes. 1,000 times yes, the Bible teaches. Paul takes this very verse and he sings this song in his beautiful passage that we have talked about in 1 Corinthians 15. Again, the Jews understood it to be referring to the coming annihilation of death itself, the taking away of the phenomenon of death. Someday that will happen. Isaiah 26 and verse 19, it brings chills up and down my spine to read this. Your dead will live. Their corpses will rise. You who lie in the dust, awake and shout for joy. For your dew is as the dew of the dawn, and the earth will give birth to the departed spirits. Beautiful. The earth will give birth to the departed spirits. I cannot think of any greater poetry ever written than these inspired words. Consider that figure, that as we see it and view it in our mind's eye. The earth itself giving birth to the departed spirits. Again, a number of things are suggested. Spirits will depart from our bodies, just as we have seen in these other verses. And one day they will come back. The earth, composed of dust, much of which was once the bodies of human beings, it will give birth again to the departed spirits. This is a hint of resurrection. And the Jewish interpreters always understood it in that way. They used this to demonstrate there would be a resurrection. Now, when I say Jewish interpreters, there is an exception, one side of Judaism that denied it. You recall that in Matthew chapter 22, verses 23 down to 33. The Lord had an exchange with one party of the Jews, the Sadducees. Now, the Sadducees, someone says they were sad, you see, because they denied the resurrection of the dead. And they did. They were materialists. They had adopted ideas that apparently came from the Greeks. And we will see some of those too in studies to come. And said there will be no resurrection, no life after death at all. When you die, that's the end of you. No hope but this life. You just have blessings while you're here serving the Lord. He'll give you stuff. You'll be happy, eat, drink, and be merry. But when you die, that's the end of you, the Sadducees said. And they were so clever, they knew that Jesus had adopted a viewpoint that the Pharisees had. Not because the Pharisees had it, but because the Pharisees happened to be right in their interpretation of passages like the ones we're looking at in the Old Testament. They happened to be right. And Jesus endorsed the Sadducees. You know, they're so smart. And they come to the Lord and they say, let us tell you this story. There was this woman who was married to this man and he died and they had no children together. So according to the law of levirate marriage taught in the Old Testament, she had to marry his brother in order to raise up seed to her brother, to his brother, to her former husband. Well, that didn't happen either. So she got married to 7 different brothers. In the resurrection, whose wife shall she be? Since they all had her. Boy, aren't they smart? So clever. Now, rather than showing there's a dilemma in resurrection teaching, Jesus looked at them, probably, I don't know why I would say contempt, but probably with just sadness, shaking his head saying, ye do err, not knowing the scriptures, nor the power of God. Here's the first thing. In the resurrection, they're not going to be married. There's no such thing. So, you've just blown your whole argument out of the water. Secondly, he asked, have you not read? And we will see Exodus 3 and verse 6, that in the Old Testament God said, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he said that to Moses. This was centuries after Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had died physically. God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. So presently, when he was talking to Moses, he was still the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were still alive somewhere. So the Sadducees were wrong. So I mention that to say when I speak of the Jewish interpretation, I am particularly thinking about what we might call the Pharisaical and the Jesus interpretation of these passages. Someone said, well, that's just a passage in Isaiah that has to do with national restoration. There could be an application to that, but it wouldn't be understood unless they knew something about the concept of a literal resurrection. The whole idea of a nation rising takes its cue from the concept they entertain, as we are seeing, of individuals possibly rising from the dead. Isaiah 53, yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. Very familiar passage, talking about the Messiah. He's put him to grief when his soul makes an offering for guilt. He shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. Now, the point here is to see that this prediction about Christ who died for us is a prediction also of how after he dies a sacrificial death, even after that, God will prolong his days. How could that be? If the Sadducees are correct when they argue that there's nothing after this life. So we've looked at some of these passages in the pre-exilic books, the books before the exile of the people of Judah. And here's some summaries. Yes, they taught human survival. These books do. And resurrection. That particular kind of survival is also mentioned where there's a reuniting of the body and the spirit in those books. It's hinted at. And so now, in order better to understand this, let's look at a few key words. The key words are the ones we've been speaking of. Sheol. Now this is a term for the unseen world of the dead, the place of the deceased. Some scholars have argued, no, that's just a euphemism. It's just a polite way of speaking of the grave. Sheol just refers to the grave itself, the tomb. And one great conservative scholar tried to make that case, but he was simply mistaken. And all scholars who have recognized his error have pointed out, no, the context will not allow that. This word is used in too many ways to refer just to the grave itself, as we will see. The dead exist in this place called Sheol. And the dead are conscious. They are aware of their existence. And yet, when we have passages about Sheol, and this is a summary of them, it seems to be a place where they're sort of passive. They're not real active. There's not a lot going on in Sheol. And it's not always portrayed as a very happy place. Remember, it's the place of the dead. And usually when passages are written about Sheol, they're written from our perspective as we view one who's died and gone on to another place. We can't see what's happening there. So from our perspective, the dead don't seem to be doing much, and they don't seem to know anything from our point of view here under the sun. The Hebrews would often have a tendency to express things strongly. You know, those who love the Lord hate evil. You know, it's very black and white in the Hebrew mind. And this is the way they would view Sheol. It's a place you didn't want to be. You don't want to have to die and go there. But they recognize all of us will. All of us go to Sheol. Both the righteous and the unrighteous. In 1 Samuel 28:19, we have one of the most fascinating stories where Saul went to the witch of Endor. Now that was contrary to the law of Moses. There are so many things, so many levels that are wrong with this, and yet it's a fascinating scene. So Saul sneaks into this witch and pretends like he's somebody else. Because Saul already said it was illegal to be a witch, sorcerer. But there were still a few around, so he didn't want to scare it, so he goes in and wants to conjure up the soul of Samuel. So the witch of Endor, she's going through her tricks, and she's going to bring up the ghost of Samuel. And it worked. Scared her. She had no, because these charlatans, they got their little tricks. This time it really worked. And Samuel came, and he actually did speak to Saul, and he said, tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. Saul and his sons were wicked. So they were going to be in that place called Sheol. They were going to be in the same place where righteous Samuel was, although, as we will see in other teaching, not in the same compartment. In Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 22, the record says, for a fire is kindled by my anger, and it burns to the depths of Sheol, devours the earth in its increase, and sets on fire the foundations of the mountains. Again, that seems to suggest there will be punishment for some in Sheol. And as I've said already, this word is an equivalent to the Greek word Hades, which is passed into English as Hades. That's the way it's consistently translated. And then you probably remember this from yesteryear when we looked at this. There's a word called the Rephaim. It's a plural word. In a few contexts, it seems to refer to giants in the land, certain peoples in the land. But in others, that's not what it means. In other contexts, the Rephaim are, well, I don't want to be scary. I don't want to scare the kids, but the Rephaims are shades of human beings, shadows left over for my life now in the body. Something will be left over, the shades. The Greeks later will call it the skiai. Again, plural. Skiai would be the shades. You know how you walk and you're in the sunlight and you see your shadow? It has kind of a reality, but vaguely so. Well, this is the takeoff idea. There are shades in Sheol. They are spirits of the departed. These Rephaim are mentioned in various passages. You get a chance, you can look some of these up and read them. It's sort of scary to me. And I would say that they are partly equivalent to our concept of ghosts. Does the Bible teach there are ghosts? Well, here's the major difference. The Rephaim are in Sheol. Our ghosts will leave our body. They go off to this unseen world, and there they are confined. Whereas with modern ghost stories, they're floating around here, aggravating people and so on. So that is one major difference. So they're not exactly the same as our concept of ghosts, but there are similarities. What this tells me is that there will be continued existence of me or of you after this life is over. Our same identity. Then there's another important word in the Old Testament, ruach, which would basically be translated as spirit. The Hebrew word, which can in some cases mean wind. In some cases mean the breath, but in other cases not mean either wind or breath physically, but mean the non-material part of us, the spirit. And that's the part that does depart at death. It can mean the rational mind. And this is the way we use the word spirit today also, the part that thinks, the ruach. It gives life to us. It animates our bodies, the ruach, in these passages. It will return to God, according to the wise man, Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 7. The ruach will return back to him. There are some cases where there are spirits that are mentioned, alien spirits. We might call them in the New Testament terms, demons. But these are known as the ruach, or the spirits, and they could overwhelm other persons. So the idea of demons was even taught in the Old Testament. We have these cases. Now that's kind of spooky. It really is. And again, it shows this to be a very similar concept to what we know of as ghost stories. But they're not just stories. There are cases where things like that happen. And it seems that these spirits, if they're the departed spirits of wicked human beings, could aggravate people. A demon then was just a disembodied personality. A personality that was not in a body. And this was a ruach in the Hebrew. So they could conceive also of a human spirit as surviving in a disembodied state. If they could conceive of demonic personalities in that state, if not, why not? That's a very easy leap for the mind to make, and I think it's one that was intended. We have another passage. We have Eliphaz here talking in the book of Job, chapter 4, verses 13 to 16. And we don't know if he's right. He may be just, as we say, blowing smoke. But the thing about it is what he says, whether he's telling the truth or he's just kind of fabricating a little bit. Eliphaz, he's not an inspired man. There is an inspired record about what he says, and that's what we're going to read. But he will bring up an idea that was common then. He said, amid thoughts from visions of the night, when deep sleep falls on men, dread came upon me and trembling, which made all my bones shake. A spirit glided past my face. The hair of my flesh stood up. It stood still, but I could not discern its appearance. A form was before my eyes. There was silence. Then I heard a voice. I can't tell you if that really happened to Eliphaz. He said it did. Somebody says, yeah, but he dreamed that. Okay, if he dreamed that, he dreamed about something of which he had a concept, a previous concept. This shows that, as I've said many, many times, that all cultures of all times have always seemed to entertain this belief in a spirit entity of humans that can live outside the body. Ghosts, as we would say it in common parlance. Then there's another word in the Hebrew, nephesh. It's used a lot in the Old Testament. It means something like being. Remember how God breathed into Adam's lifeless body the breath of life, and man became a living soul? Well, that's the King James translation. It's literally in the Hebrew a nephesh, a living nephesh, or living creature. The thing is, other animals themselves are also called the nephesh, or creature. So we can't say it's something uniquely human in that regard. They have also that kind of soul, as it were. We can maybe translate it as soul, to be consistent in English, and we could translate the word we looked at previously, ruach, as spirit. Now, often we think of just the opposite way, but in the Bible it seems to be that the soul is the part that animates the body, and the spirit is the part that survives. Though there are exceptions here and there, and you can't make a clear-cut case every single time. So let's look at a summary of what we have seen. We have asked about the time before the exile, and we've asked, do they teach that there will be personal survival? These books, and the answer is, of course, yes. What part of us will survive? Well, we know the ruach will survive. There are some passages, too, in the Bible that suggest the nephesh may survive. But perhaps in that case, the writer's deliberately confusing the idea or making ambiguous the idea between ruach and nephesh. In the final analysis, there may not be a major difference, as there isn't. And the Hebrew writer says that the Word of God is so fine in its ability to cut, it can discern between the joints and marrow and the soul and spirit. And that's a very fine distinction indeed. How is the underworld described, the place of departed humans after this life? Well, it was often dark and gloomy, a very passive place. And the Rephaim, the spirits that are there, are very weak and pessimistic. You know, when we tell ghost stories, we usually have them moaning. The ghosts moan. Why? Well, they're unhappy. Why? Because I don't want to be dead. There's no future in it, Curly Howard used to say. But do these texts teach that there will be a resurrection of the body? Yes, resoundingly yes. And that all will survive, or just some? All, both the righteous and the unrighteous. And there will be punishment. Retribution in the broadest sense, rewards for the righteous, and punishment for the wicked. These are found especially in later texts. Now, if we had time, we could look at this in more detail, but time has failed us. There's the concept of the tree of life, speaks of immortality in the Old Testament. We have cases of both Enoch and later Elijah translated into heaven. Now, that suggests the possibility of continued existence, though not in the same way as resurrection itself. Then there are some cases where prophets with the ability to work miracle could resuscitate dead bodies. Resuscitate. I did not say resurrect, and we ought to be careful. Let's don't call these cases resurrections, because technically they're not resurrections, because in a resurrection, a body is transformed when it's raised and it will live forever. This is not the case here. Merely a dead body would be brought back to life. The spirit would be united, but the body would not be transformed. It would still be a mortal body and would someday die again. We have some cases here where that happened, as we also have in the New Testament. In Exodus 3 and verse 6, as we mentioned, Jesus said, the statement to Moses that I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is sufficient to show he's the God of the living. That to the Sadducees. Abraham believed in the idea of resurrection. We're going to see more, the Lord willing, this afternoon about the beliefs of Abraham. And it's fascinating to see where they may have come from. In Genesis chapter 22, he had faith that God could even raise up his son Isaac. He knew God told him to kill Isaac. Now that wouldn't work, to bring up a large nation from Isaac, since he didn't have any children yet, unless God could raise him from the dead. So Abraham thought, I'll kill him and God will raise him from the dead. That's not exactly how it worked out, but that's what Abraham believed, so it was an idea even then. David, of course, committed sin with Bathsheba, and she was with child as a result of that illicit union. And God would not allow that child to come into this world healthy. And the baby was sick and at the point of death. And David begged and he prayed. But finally, the child died. There was nothing more that could be done. The child died. And so he anointed himself with oil. He got cleaned up. He took bread. And he went about his daily affairs. But now he has died. He said, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me. Now this is like the idea you read elsewhere about one who dies and is gathered to his people. I think there's more than just his corpse is put in the same tomb where his people's, his family's corpses are found. I believe it refers to the fact he could actually be with him and alive with him. And David himself said in the beautiful 23rd Psalm, I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Now if that's to be taken literally, this is a concept of life after death. So here's what we've looked at. The Old Testament is not silent on this subject, and it clearly teaches there will even be a resurrection. So when we die, that is not the end of us. We have a hope. We have a hope of life after death, and it is a hope well-founded on this book. And this book comes with wonderful testimony that it, and it alone, is the Word of God. As we shall see this afternoon, personal testimonies are irrelevant. What I think, what I feel will happen, and what people tell me happened to them, and the stories they want to recount, those things really don't matter. What this book says is all that matters, and it tells us, it reveals to us, by the Spirit of God, there will be life after death. And sadly, many who do not get themselves ready in this life will not be prepared to meet their Lord, and will suffer a bitter end after this life is over. As again, we'll see that has been the viewpoint of almost all peoples who have ever lived, with some few exceptions. This is why we're here. This is why you and I are Christians. Everything else pales into insignificance. This is the most important thing we could consider. Yes, we're all getting older. And as we get older and frail, we know our bodies are deteriorating before our eyes, and they're just not meant to last. They won't last forever. At best, they'll be here a few more years. Then what? Then what? The Bible says, then what? It is appointed unto men once to die, but after that, the judgment, Hebrews 9 and verse 27. And as we will see, it is appointed unto men to once to die. And immediately after that, immediately as we are seeing, there is a place in the Old Testament called Sheol, in the New Testament called Hades, and we will explore that more this afternoon, the Lord willing. But the reason we viewed all this is a motivator. I would hope it is to me. It's a motivator to make us live righteous lives and to continue steadfastly. This is what Paul says, 1 Corinthians 15:58. When he describes all of this information and puts it all together, he says, therefore, my beloved brethren, be ye steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, for as much as you know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. However small or however great, it will someday really count for something. Why? Because there is life after death. If you're subject to the invitation, let us know right now while we together stand and sing.